Alright guys, welcome to your next flipped classroom lecture. We got a big one today. We're diving into the idea and the history surrounding what's called the Hemingway Code. And to do that, we're going to look at a speech by Teddy Roosevelt. We're going to talk a little bit about World War I, and hopefully get a better understanding of the quote-unquote American man as it existed at the start of the 19th century. So, let's jump in. First off, what is the code? By code, we mean a system of beliefs or rules to live by. Everybody has codes. They have a system of beliefs, a way they operate around things, and rules that they kind of live by and adhere to. Not everybody has them as clear in their mind as Hemingway did. And this is really because authors are more of cultural indicators than cultural creators. And what I mean by that is that authors are really more of weather vanes, showing us which direction the wind is blowing, rather than actually being the thing blowing the weather vane, than making the wind blow. So they tell us things about culture, more so than they actually create the culture itself. Hemingway was born at a very unique time in American history. Lots of changes were about to happen and were in the process of happening. We talked a little bit about on Monday, we know that Hemingway was born in the year 1899, which is also when Teddy Roosevelt gave his speech. Roosevelt's speech, as we're going to look at in class today and on Wednesday, dealt with a return to American ideals. And Hemingway was really in a unique position because he experienced World War I as a young man after coming of age, growing up in this time period when Roosevelt's talking about these American ideals, and really struggled to balance these two things for the rest of his life and to try to find a way to make sense of the things he had grown up thinking and then the things that he experienced at an early age in the war. Hemingway's code, because he was an author, he was able to write about it, and it kind of bled into his fiction, and his fictional code kind of bled into his real life, and he really has this interweaving, like we've been talking about, of reality of Hemingway the person versus the character that he almost kind of becomes. He almost becomes a character like the characters in his story. And it's really a unique position, as it says on this slide. So in 1899, Teddy Roosevelt goes to the Hamilton Club, which is in Chicago. And he gives this speech to a bunch of businessmen that is called several things. The strenuous life, it's his speech to the Hamilton Club. And he identifies what he considers the traits of the quote-unquote American man. And it really has to do with embracing the ideas of hard work and then overcoming difficulty for the continued betterment of the nation. And it's these two ideas. The first one is that a strenuous life is a good life. A life full of hard work is a good life, and that more so overcoming hardship, conquering things, overcoming adversity is a good thing, and it only makes the nation better in and of itself. The 1890s, 1899 is the start of the Industrial Revolution, getting towards the tail end of the Industrial Revolution and the increasing urbanization of America. And so the Industrial Revolution, remember, is when factories are first starting up and we're able to make things on a large scale. And the urbanization is people going from the country, from the countryside, from the farmsteads, into the cities and the suburbs, because that's where the factory jobs were. However, factory jobs weren't necessarily seen as being challenging and as rigorous and as hardworking as life on the farm, life in the country. And so there were a lot of people who feared that America was becoming a weaker nation, that this reliance on city living was making people soft, and that the factory jobs, being indoors, were making people soft and kind of weak. And what Roosevelt's really kind of calling for is a return to the kind of Wild West. And this idea of the very individualistic man, able to do whatever it is he needs to do, able to overcome things, and kind of better himself because of that. Into this mix, in 1914, comes World War I. World War I was the first mechanized war, and by that, I mean we had such things as the invention of the machine gun was in World War I. We also had the first use of nerve gas, barbed wire had just been invented, and then lastly, tanks were beginning to make themselves known and used. And this combination of things really created what had never before been seen, and it was just a bloody, bloody war. That we got really, really good at inflicting pain and suffering on other people. And all of this served to de-romanticize war. Prior to World War I, we have this very romantic, very poetic image of war, and of men fighting against each other, and it was man versus man, and it was a very idealized idea of war. And all of these things, the machine guns and the nerve gas and the barbed wire and the tanks, really served to show war for the horrible, horrible experience that it was. And it really caused people to lose both their faith in God, because they found out that in the war, praying didn't save them, that it didn't matter how much they prayed, that they would still die just the same as the people next to them. And also lose their faith in their country, because their country had sent them over here to war, telling them that they were going there for good reasons, and they were brave and noble men, and they got there and they were dying in the mud and in the trenches, and they were choking on gas that they couldn't see, and it really caused people to lose faith in their country as well as their religion. And it was a very serious thing. And this is what Hemingway goes into. Hemingway enters the war in 1917, is when America officially enters the war. Hemingway enters the war and experiences all of this firsthand after having come up in Teddy Roosevelt's American Man time. So World War I destroys a generation of men's belief in salvation promised by religion and in the efficacy of government. And because of this, Hemingway begins to develop his own code, his own system of beliefs in terms of how he sees things. And part of the Hemingway code says that death is the end, that there is no afterlife, there's nothing left. At the same time, because there is nothing else, it is up to man to create meaning, that we can't count on anything else, that there's no God, that it is just up to man to create meaning in what is otherwise seen as a meaningless world. And the way that man does this is by having dignity in the face of adversity and embarrassment, and in maintaining this calm composure, and in never seeming to be afraid, and always remaining the brave individual that everyone knew that they could be. And this idea was that if you could maintain your dignity, if you could remain calm, that even when you lost, you still won. That you were able to maintain your composure and maintain your dignity, and you were still winning because they hadn't taken that away from you, no matter what had happened. And this is where we get Hemingway's idea that a man could be destroyed, right? He could lose, but he's not defeated because he still has his dignity. He's still able to hold his head up high and say that he tried his best and that he accomplished as much as he could. And these are kind of the foundational beliefs of Hemingway's code, is that there is no afterlife, so it's up to man to create meaning because the world itself has no meaning, and man creates that meaning through the face of being dignified in all of his endeavors, because that way, even when he loses, even when he's defeated or destroyed, he's not been defeated, that he has maintained his masculinity and his composure. And we see this in calmness during violence, disorder, and chaos. And Hemingway said that a man who lives correctly, following the ideals of honor, courage, and endurance, in a world that is sometimes chaotic, often stressful, and always painful. This idea later becomes called the idea of grace under pressure. That even when things are crazy, even when the world is falling apart, that this character is able to hold it together, keep it together, and not have everything not lose their own composure as a result. However, some of the actions, and now these are some things that we see in the fictional world in terms of Hemingway's creations, but also in his own life sometimes, is that this man, this Hemingway hero, this Hemingway's code, they still are scared of the night, that they don't necessarily like the night. And that's because to them, the night symbolizes death, and death is bad. Death is unavoidable. And so what they have is night symbolizes death, so they're fearful of the night. But at the same time, they have this desire to live their life to the fullest extent possible. And we see both of these things in Jake Barnes all the time. We know that he says that night is when he gets the most emotional, it's when he cries, he doesn't like to be alone at night, and he tries to live his life as fully as he can and kind of pursue everything that he can. And the other aspects of the Hemingway Code are also seen in that a man who follows the Hemingway Code, he drinks heavily but never sloppy, and that he is skilled and knowledgeable. And these are the other things, the actions that a Hemingway man undertakes. He drinks heavily, and he's also skilled in something. And we know that Jake is skilled. We know he's a good fisherman, and we know he knows a lot about bullfighting, and that he appears to be a good newspaperman, and so Jake has these skills as well. And so these things create the fictional version of the Hemingway Code. So what we have with the Hemingway Code is we have, from 1899, we have the speech. And the speech sets up what the American man needs to be. And the American man is basically what we would think of as the Wild West. We'll say the cowboy. Tough, resilient, reliable, calm, heavy drinking, talented, grace under pressure. All these things in the cowboy. But at the other end, in 1917, we have World War I. And in World War I, what we encounter is there's no God. There's only death. And that life is more or less meaningless when you get down to it. That it's just chaotic and messy and painful. And there is no greater meaning. And these two ideas, this speech and this experience, combine together and really kind of create the Hemingway man. The Hemingway Code, combine these two together, which brings us to this belief in yourself that you are the strongest person. But also an idea that there is no faith, that life is not going to work out, there's no afterlife, there's no great light at the end of the tunnel, that there is only yourself. And therefore, it's all about finding personal meaning. That you can't count on there being some prize at the end, that it's only about what you can come up with. And it's this combination of these two distinct events, Roosevelt's speech in 1899, which really sets up for the country what the President of the United States thinks a man should be. And at this time, you have to understand how important that is, that the President's coming out and saying, these are the things that make somebody a man. And then you have this young man who grew up in that kind of culture, going off to war, and seeing that all of those things seemed very untrue, and seemed like lies. And between those two things, creating this idea of there's only me, there's only myself to believe in, and so I have to stick with it. And the best way I can do that is through personal meaning, and again, through this sense of dignity and composure. And we see all of these things exemplified in Jake Barnes, but also in Ernest Hemingway himself, and these same ideas of dignity, belief in the self, no faith in the afterlife, and in creating his own personal meaning. And that's Hemingway's code, both for his fiction and for his life as well.